Dad left everything to me. I'm sorry, Ellen. My brother's voice was flat, rehearsed, like he'd practiced saying it in a mirror before walking into that office. If you've ever watched someone rewrite your family's history in a single sentence, stay with me. This is family betrayal verdict. I sat frozen in the leather chair across from the lawyer's desk, my hands cold against the armrests, my mind refusing to fully process what I'd just heard. That's not what he told me, I said. Not ever. People change their minds at the end, Ellen, my Aunt Susan said gently from the seat beside me. That happens. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Harold Voss, cleared his throat and continued reading, his voice carrying the same clinical detachment he'd probably used for 100 other families' worst days. The will names Marcus Whitfield as sole beneficiary of the estate, including the family home, all financial accounts, and the remaining shares of Whitfield Hardware. I stared at Marcus across the table, searching his face for some flicker of discomfort, some acknowledgement of how impossible this felt. He met my eyes steadily, no guilt visible anywhere in his expression. This can't be right, I said. Dad and I talked about the estate 2 years ago. He specifically said it would be split evenly. 50-50, he said. Those were his exact words. This will supersede any prior version, Harold said carefully. It's dated and notarized just 3 weeks before his passing. 3 weeks. The number landed strangely in my chest, though I couldn't yet articulate why it felt so wrong. Can I see it? I asked. The actual document? Harold slid the papers across the desk, and I forced my trembling hands to hold them steady, scanning the signature page at the bottom. Dad's signature was there, but something about it looked different from the one I remembered, shakier, the letters slightly compressed, nothing like the confident, looping script he'd used on birthday cards and grocery lists for as long as I could remember. I photographed the signature page with my phone before I could second-guess the impulse, some instinct telling me I might need it later even though I didn't yet understand why. Was anyone else present when he signed this? I asked. Just the notary, Harold said. Standard procedure. Which notary? Harold glanced at his file. A Gregory Pruitt. He operates independently, not affiliated with this firm. I filed that name away, my mind working slowly through shock toward something sharper, more focused, though I couldn't yet name what I was searching for. Dad was on heavy medication those last weeks, I said. The pain management, after the surgery complications. Are we certain he was fully lucid when he signed this? Marcus shifted in his seat. The notary confirmed he understood what he was signing. That's all that's legally required. That's all that's legally required, I repeated slowly. Not the same thing as it being true. Ellen, Susan said, her voice carrying gentle warning now. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be. Your father made his choice. Did he? I said quietly. Or did someone help him make it? Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack I'd seen in his composure since I'd walked into the office. I was the one who stayed, he said, his voice hardening. I was the one who drove him to every appointment, who sat with him through every bad night. You were 3 states away, Ellen, building your own life while I put mine on hold for him. I called every single week, I said. I flew back every month I could afford to. It wasn't the same, Marcus said. And apparently, Dad agreed. I sat with that accusation for a long moment, the particular sting of watching my own grief and effort dismissed so completely, reduced to insufficient compared to whatever version of devotion Marcus was now claiming for himself. Harold cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable with the tension filling the small office. I understand this is difficult. If you'd like to contest the will formally, you're within your rights to consult independent counsel. I intend to, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Marcus stood, gathering his copy of the documents with brisk efficiency. This is going to get messy if you push it, Ellen. Is that really how you want to remember Dad? Fighting over his estate in court. I think it's already messy, I said. I just didn't build the mess. I'm only asking questions about it. He left without responding further, Susan following close behind him, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a gesture that felt more like obligation than comfort. I sat alone in Harold's office for a long moment after they'd gone, the photographed signature page still glowing faintly on my phone screen, my father's shaky, unfamiliar handwriting staring back at me like a puzzle I didn't yet have enough pieces to solve. "Is there anything else you can tell me about how this was processed?" I asked Harold. He hesitated, glancing toward the door Marcus had just exited through. "I only handled the reading, Mrs. Whitfield Carter. The drafting and notarization were done independently, outside our firm's usual process. Your father specifically requested it that way, according to Marcus." "Specifically requested it," I repeated slowly. "Or someone else specifically arranged it?" Harold didn't answer that, his careful professional silence saying more than any direct response could have. I drove to my father's house afterward, letting myself in with the key I'd never returned, the familiar smell of his old cardigan still hanging by the door catching me off guard the moment I stepped inside. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, breathing in that particular scent, cedar and pipe tobacco, faint but unmistakable, and let myself feel, fully, the specific grief of losing him twice now, once to illness, and once to whatever this signature page actually represented. My private memory arrived unbidden, the way grief always seemed to visit uninvited, my father at the kitchen table, years earlier, sliding an old fountain pen across to me. "This was your grandfather's. Someday it's yours, along with everything else, split evenly between you and your brother. That's how families are supposed to work, Ellen girl." I hadn't imagined that promise. I was certain of that much, even standing here now in a house that legally, according to a document signed 3 weeks before his death, no longer belonged to me at all. The vulnerability passed slowly, but something steadier began to settle beneath it as I stood there in the quiet of his empty house, my phone still holding the photograph of a signature that looked less and less, the longer I studied it, like anything my father would have written on his own. I called my father's oncologist the next morning, my hand steady despite the uncertainty still churning beneath the surface. "I need to understand his cognitive state during his final weeks," I said. "Specifically around the 3rd week before he passed." "I can share general information," Dr. Alvarez said carefully, "but for detailed records, you'll need to request them formally through the hospital's release office. I can tell you that his pain management protocol was significant during that period. The medication combination we used can affect clarity and memory retention." "Significant enough to affect his ability to understand legal documents?" "That would depend on dosage timing relative to any signing," she said. "I'd recommend requesting the full medication administration log alongside his records." I thanked her and hung up, already composing the formal records request in my mind before I'd even set the phone down. That afternoon, Marcus called, his voice carrying none of the sharpness from the lawyer's office, replaced instead by something softer, more careful. "I've been thinking about yesterday," he said. "I don't want this to turn into something ugly between us." "Dad wouldn't have wanted that." "Dad wouldn't have wanted a lot of things," I said. "Including, I suspect, this will." "Why does this will look so different from the one he showed me years ago?" I asked. "The one where he specifically told me it would be split evenly." "Maybe he just updated it," Marcus said, his tone carrying practiced patience. "People do that, Ellen. Circumstances change." 2 weeks before he died, while he was on heavy medication? That's not updating. That's something else entirely. The line went quiet for a moment. "You're being dramatic." He was lucid enough to sign a legal document. The notary confirmed it. "The notary you arranged," I said. "Not Dad's usual attorney. Dad trusted me to handle the logistics," Marcus said, his patience finally cracking slightly. "I was here, Ellen. Every single day." "You weren't." "I was 3 states away because that's where my job was," I said. "Not because I stopped caring." "It felt that way sometimes," he said, his voice quieter now, almost convincing in its wounded sincerity. "You have no idea what it was like, watching him decline while you were building a life somewhere else." I sat with that accusation for a moment, the particular ache of having my absence weaponized against me, even though every week I'd called, every visit I'd scraped together the money and vacation days for, had felt, at the time, like doing everything I possibly could. "I need to go," I said, and hung up before he could continue reshaping the narrative any further. That evening, I pulled up years of old text messages with my father, scrolling back through months and years of conversations, check-ins about his health, updates about my life, the small, ordinary texture of a relationship that had never once felt distant to me. I found the message I was looking for, dated exactly 2 years earlier. "Talked to the lawyer today. Made sure everything's split fair between you and your brother. Don't want either of you fighting over an old man's things someday." I photographed the message, forwarding it to my own private email, my hands trembling slightly now, not from uncertainty but from the sharp clarity of having proof directly contradicting everything Marcus had been quietly implying. My phone buzzed. "Susan. I talked to Marcus," she said. "He's worried about you contesting this, Ellen. He says it'll tear the family apart." "The family's already torn apart, Susan. I just didn't do the tearing." "He mentioned you'd been distant those last years," she said carefully. "That it was hard on your father, not having you close by." There it was again, the same rewritten history, now spreading through the family the way lies always seem to travel faster than truth. "I have 2 years of text messages proving I called him every single week," I said. "I have a message from him, in his own words, saying the estate would be split evenly." "I'm not distant, Susan. I'm documented." She was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't realize you had actual proof." Marcus made it sound like a feeling, not a fact. "It's a fact," I said. "I can send it to you, if you want to see it yourself instead of just taking his word for it." Another pause, longer this time. "Maybe you should. I don't like feeling like I'm choosing sides based on whoever talks to me first." It wasn't full support, but it was the first real crack I'd heard in the family's assumption that Marcus's version was automatically the true one. That night, I sat in my father's study, going through old files methodically, searching for anything that might clarify the timeline further. I found his medical calendar, tucked into a drawer, dates and appointment times recorded in his own increasingly unsteady handwriting as the weeks progressed toward his death. The entry for the day the will was allegedly signed read simply, "Pain bad today. Slept most of afternoon." My hands went still over the page. If he'd slept most of the afternoon, heavily medicated and barely functional according to his own recorded words, how exactly had he found the clarity to review and sign a legal document that same day? I photographed the calendar entry, my pulse quickening, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves into a shape I was no longer willing to dismiss as coincidence. If you've ever had to prove your own devotion with screenshots because someone else's convenient version was spreading faster than the truth, you understand why receipts matter more than rehearsed narratives. Stay close, because the truth was only beginning to surface. I called Harold Voss the next morning. "I need copies of everything related to the will's notarization. Every document, every timestamp." "I can request that from Mr. Pruitt's office," Harold said. "Though independent notaries aren't always required to maintain extensive records beyond the basic certification." "Then I need whatever exists," I said. "And I need to speak with my father's original attorney, the one who handled his estate planning years ago, before any of this." "I believe that was Franklin Cole," Harold said. "He retired a few years back, but I can try to track down contact information." "Please," I said. I think he might remember exactly what my father actually wanted, before someone decided to rewrite it for him. Franklin Cole agreed to meet me at a small diner near his retirement community, his handshake firm despite his 81 years, his eyes sharp with the particular clarity of someone who'd spent decades paying close attention to details. "Ellen Whitfield," he said, settling into the booth across from me. "I remember your father well. Good man. Careful man when it came to his affairs." "I need to ask you about his original estate plan," I said. "The one you drafted, before he passed." "I drafted several versions over the years," Franklin said. The final one I worked on with him directly was about 3 years back. Equal division between you and your brother, with specific provisions for the hardware store shares to be split according to involvement level, but the core estate divided evenly. That matches what he told me, I said, relief and confirmation tangling together in my chest. He was very specific about it, Franklin continued. Made a point of telling me he didn't want either of you feeling shortchanged. Family harmony mattered enormously to him. Did you know he apparently signed a new will 3 weeks before he died? Through a different notary? Franklin's expression shifted, something careful and concerned settling into his features. No. I wasn't aware of that. That's unusual, given our long-standing arrangement. He never mentioned wanting to make changes. Could you tell me anything about his mental state, in general, during his final months? Anything you might have observed? I visited him twice, socially, during that period, Franklin said slowly. The second visit, about a month before he passed, he was having significant difficulty following conversation threads. Repeated himself several times without realizing it. I remember feeling concerned, though I attributed it to the medication at the time. I recorded our conversation with his permission, my hand steady now despite everything the confirmation was stirring beneath the surface. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement if this needs to go to court? I asked. Franklin considered this for a long moment. I would. Your father was a friend, as much as a client, over the years. If someone manipulated his final wishes, I'd want the truth to come out, regardless of family complications. I thanked him, my chest tight with something between grief and vindication, and drove home with his recorded statement saved carefully alongside everything else I'd been gathering. That evening, Marcus called again, his tone shifting once more, this time carrying an edge I hadn't heard from him since the lawyer's office. I heard you've been talking to Franklin Cole, he said. Digging up old business. I'm trying to understand what actually happened, Marcus. You really think a judge will believe you over a signed, notarized will? His voice hardened. This is going to cost you more than you think if you push it, Ellen. Legal fees, family relationships, all of it. I think a judge will want to know why it was signed while he could barely hold a pen, I said. Careful, Marcus. That sounds less like brotherly advice and more like a warning. Take it however you want, he said. But contesting this will cost more than you think, in every sense. The threat landed clearly despite its careful wrapping, familiar now in its shape, the same tactic Susan and Marcus both seemed to have adopted, concern dressed up as caution, designed to make me doubt whether pursuing the truth was worth whatever price he was implying I'd pay for it. Is that a threat? I asked. It's reality, he said, echoing language I recognized instantly as rehearsed, deployed before against someone else, somewhere, sometime. He hung up before I could respond further, the dial tone humming cold in my ear. I sat with that conversation for a long moment, my hands trembling slightly, before something steadier settled beneath the unease. That night, I sat in my father's study again, holding the old fountain pen he'd once promised me, the one meant to symbolize an inheritance divided fairly between his children. My private memory surfaced, gentle and aching, my father teaching me to write my name in cursive with that exact pen, his hand guiding mine across the paper, patient in a way that had defined so much of my childhood. Every letter matters, Ellen girl. Take your time. Don't let anyone rush you through something important. I hadn't understood, then, how literally that advice might someday apply to something far more consequential than handwriting practice. The vulnerability passed slowly, but I set the pen down gently, letting the memory settle into resolve instead of grief. I called Harold the next morning. I need everything you can find on Gregory Pruitt, the notary. His background, his history, any connection to my brother. I'll look into it, Harold said. Though independent notaries can be difficult to fully investigate without formal legal proceedings underway. Then let's start those proceedings, I said. I have a recorded statement from my father's original attorney, medical calendar entries showing significant impairment on the day of signing, and text messages proving my father's original intent to split the estate evenly. That's substantial, Harold said, something shifting in his tone, more attentive now than during our first meeting. I can help you file a formal contest. But Ellen, I need to tell you, if this notary was connected to your brother in some way, that raises serious questions about undue influence, possibly even fraud. I know, I said quietly. I think that's exactly what happened. I hung up and sat alone in the quiet study, the fountain pen resting on the desk in front of me, the recorded statement from Franklin Cole saved securely alongside everything else, and let myself feel, for the first time since this began, something steadier than grief. Whatever Marcus had arranged in those final weeks, however carefully he'd built this new version of my father's wishes, I finally had enough pieces gathering into a shape too solid to be dismissed as bitterness or jealousy. Harold called 3 days later, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard from him before. I found something you need to see, Ellen. About Gregory Pruitt. I met him at his office that afternoon, the same room where the will had first been read, though it felt entirely different now, charged with purpose instead of shock. Gregory Pruitt and your brother attended the same fraternity in college, Harold said, sliding a printed article across his desk. There's a photo here, from a charity golf event 2 years ago. They're standing together, clearly familiar with each other. I stared at the image, my father's face nowhere in this world where the two men who'd apparently determined his final wishes had known each other long before any of this began. That's not disclosed anywhere in the notarization paperwork, I said slowly. It should have been, Harold said. A personal relationship between the notary and a beneficiary creates a significant conflict of interest, especially given the circumstances of the signing. That evening, Marcus showed up at my hotel unannounced, his expression carefully arranged into something between concern and wounded innocence. I heard you're pursuing this formally now, he said, settling into the chair across from mine without being invited to sit. I only did this because Dad trusted me to handle things, Ellen. I don't understand why you're making it so difficult. He trusted you to handle things, I said. Not to erase me from them. His jaw tightened. You don't know what it was like, being the one who stayed. Watching him get weaker every single day, managing his medications, his appointments, his fear. You got to remember him as he used to be. I had to watch him disappear. For a moment, something in his voice sounded almost genuinely wounded, and I let myself sit with the possibility that some of his resentment might be real, even if it didn't excuse what he'd done. I'm sorry that was hard for you, I said carefully. Truly. But that doesn't explain Gregory Pruitt, Marcus. Your college friend, notarizing a will that conveniently erased my inheritance 3 weeks before Dad died. His face went still, something calculating replacing the earlier wounded expression. That's a coincidence. Gregory's notarized dozens of documents over the years. It doesn't mean anything. Doesn't it? I said. Because I also have Dad's medical calendar, showing he slept most of the afternoon the will was allegedly signed. I have his original attorney's recorded statement, confirming Dad's true wishes were an even split. I have text messages, in Dad's own words, promising the same thing. Marcus's composure finally cracked fully, something raw and defensive breaking through. You think this has been easy for me? The business has been struggling for 2 years, Ellen. I put everything into keeping it afloat while you were building your career somewhere else. I needed this. There it was, the first real admission, however unintentional, of motive beneath all his careful justifications. The business, I repeated slowly. Is that what this was actually about? He seemed to realize what he'd said, backtracking quickly. That's not what I meant. I meant I needed to know Dad's legacy would be protected, properly managed. You mean you needed the money, I said quietly. And you found a convenient way to make sure you got all of it. He stood abruptly, his earlier composure entirely gone now. You don't understand the position I was in. Then explain it to me. Clearly. Right now. He didn't, not fully. He paced instead, his movements tight and agitated, a man watching something carefully constructed finally beginning to show its cracks under direct pressure. I'll fight this, he finally said. Whatever you think you have, I'll fight it every step of the way. I expected you would, I said. That's exactly why I've spent the last 2 weeks making sure what I have is undeniable. He left without responding further, the door closing hard behind him, the sound echoing through the quiet hotel room. I sat alone afterward, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but from the particular electric clarity of finally understanding the full shape of what had happened. My private memory surfaced, unbidden, my father in his hardware store office, years earlier, showing me the business's financial records with obvious pride, explaining every detail patiently even though I'd shown little interest in the business itself at the time. Someday, Ellen girl, you'll understand why every number matters. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. I let myself feel the weight of that memory fully, the particular grief of understanding, now, how literally his warning might have applied to exactly this moment. The vulnerability passed slowly, but steadier resolve settled beneath it as I gathered my thoughts for what came next. I called Harold. I need his business financial records. Marcus's hardware store. I think the failing business is the actual motive here, not some devotion Dad never actually questioned. I can subpoena those records once we formally file the contest, Harold said. Ellen, based on everything you've gathered, I think we have a strong case. But I want to make sure we're thorough. Courts don't like assumptions. They want proof. I have proof, I said. I just need to make sure it's organized well enough that no one can dismiss it as bitterness. I believe you do, Harold said. Let's file formally this week. I'll also request the business financials as part of discovery. I hung up and sat in the quiet hotel room for a long moment, the fountain pen from my father's study now resting in my bag, a small, steady reminder of exactly what I was fighting to protect, not just an inheritance, but the truth of who my father actually was in his final weeks, and what he'd actually wanted before someone else decided to rewrite it for him. Harold's investigator found the business records within the week, and what they revealed made my stomach turn slowly over as I read through them at his office. Marcus's hardware store has been operating at a significant loss for 18 months, Harold said, sliding the documents across his desk. He took out 2 business loans in the past year alone, both nearly maxed out. 3 weeks before your father passed, he made a large, undisclosed transfer from your father's personal checking account into the business account. How large? $42,000, Harold said. Documented as a family loan, though there's no formal paperwork supporting that characterization, and your father's cognitive state at the time makes any consent highly questionable. I sat with that number for a long moment, the full shape of Marcus's motive finally becoming undeniable. That afternoon, Harold's investigator located Gregory Pruitt directly, and after some careful pressure regarding the undisclosed conflict of interest, Pruitt agreed to a formal deposition. I sat in on it from behind the glass, watching as Harold walked him methodically through the timeline. Mr. Pruitt, how did you come to notarize this particular will? Marcus contacted me directly, Pruitt said, his voice tight with obvious discomfort. Said his father wanted to update his estate quickly, given his declining health. Did you meet with the elder Mr. Whitfield personally to confirm his understanding of the document? Briefly, Pruitt admitted. He seemed tired. Marcus assured me it was just the medication making him seem less alert than usual. Did you disclose your prior personal relationship with Marcus Whitfield to your notary oversight board? Pruitt's composure finally cracked. No. I should have. Marcus asked me to move quickly, said his father didn't have much time left and wanted this settled before things got harder. I didn't think enough about the conflict. Did Marcus pressure you to expedite the process in any way? He called twice that week, pushing for a faster timeline, Pruitt said quietly. I felt uncomfortable, honestly, but I told myself it wasn't my place to question a dying man's family. I closed my eyes briefly, the confirmation landing with the particular weight of something I'd suspected but hadn't yet heard stated so plainly. After the deposition, I drove to Marcus's house, my hand steady on the wheel despite everything roaring beneath my calm exterior. He opened the door already tense, like some instinct had warned him this conversation was coming. You had him sign it while he couldn't even recognize the date, I said, standing in his doorway. I have his medical chart. It says otherwise. That's not what happened, he said, though the denial came automatic now, worn thin from overuse. I have Pruitt's deposition, I said. He admits you pressured him to move quickly. I have the $42,000 transfer, 3 weeks before Dad died, that you never disclosed. I have Franklin Cole's statement about Dad's original wishes. I have the medical calendar showing he slept most of the afternoon he supposedly signed a legal document. His face went pale, the composure he'd maintained through every previous conversation finally, completely cracking. You don't understand the pressure I was under, he said, his voice dropping. Then explain it to me. Clearly. Right now. He sat down heavily on his porch step, his hands pressed against his face for a long moment before he finally looked up again. The business was going to fail completely within months, he said. I'd already laid off half the staff. I couldn't tell Dad how bad it had gotten, not while he was already so sick. I told myself I was protecting him from more stress. So instead you took advantage of him, I said. While he was too medicated to understand what he was actually signing. I did what I had to do to survive this, he said, reaching for the kind of justification people use when they can no longer defend what they have done. You didn't survive anything, I said quietly. You just built a bigger problem on top of the first one. He didn't respond to that, the silence between us heavy with everything neither of us had fully said aloud until now. There's a probate hearing, I said. Final one, before assets distribute. I want you to know I'm bringing everything. His eyes widened slightly, panic flickering behind them. Ellen, please. Let me fix this quietly, on my own terms. You had 3 weeks with a dying man and every opportunity to fix this honestly, I said. You spent them arranging a will that erased me instead. I turned and left him sitting there on his porch steps, my hands finally steady, my breath even despite everything churning beneath the surface. Susan called that evening. Marcus told me you're moving forward with the hearing. I am, I said. I have his deposition testimony, the financial records, the medical documentation. Everything lines up. She was quiet for a long moment. I should have asked harder questions from the beginning, Ellen. I'm sorry I didn't. You're asking them now, I said. That's what matters. That night, I sat in my father's study one final time before the hearing, the fountain pen resting in my palm, the weight of everything I now understood settling into something steadier than shock or grief. Harold called just as I was preparing for bed. There's something else, Ellen. Franklin Cole mentioned something during our final prep call. He said your father left a sealed envelope with him years ago, separate from any formal will, with instructions to only open it if the estate was ever formally contested. I sat up straight, my heart suddenly pounding. What's in it? He wouldn't say over the phone, Harold said. He wants to bring it to the hearing personally. He says your father was very specific about the timing. The week before the probate hearing passed in careful, methodical preparation, Harold and I meeting almost daily to organize everything into a case too solid for any judge to dismiss. Franklin Cole confirmed he'll be there, Harold said, 3 days before the hearing. He's bringing the sealed envelope personally, as your father instructed. He wouldn't tell me the contents, only that your father was adamant it only be opened if the estate was formally challenged. I sat with that information for a long moment, an uneasy mixture of hope and fear tangled together in my chest. Do you think he knew? I asked. That Marcus might try something like this? I don't know, Harold said carefully. But your father clearly anticipated the possibility of a challenge. That suggests he had concerns about something, even if we don't yet know exactly what. 2 days before the hearing, Susan called, her voice carrying a steadiness I hadn't heard from her since this began. I want to testify, she said. About the conversations I had with your father, the years he mentioned wanting things split evenly. I should have said something sooner. Are you sure? I asked. Marcus is still your nephew. So are you, she said simply. I'm done pretending this is about family harmony when it's actually about the truth. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that clearly. The morning of the hearing arrived clear and cold, sunlight cutting sharp angles across the courthouse steps as I climbed them, the folder of evidence heavy and certain in my hands, Harold beside me, quiet and focused. Marcus was already seated when I arrived, his attorney beside him, both of them carrying the particular tension of people who suspected the ground beneath their case had grown considerably less stable. Franklin Cole arrived shortly after, moving slowly but purposefully, a sealed envelope carried carefully in a small leather portfolio under his arm. The judge, a woman named Judge Marsh, called the proceedings to order, her expression neutral as she reviewed the extensive filing Harold had submitted. We're here to address a formal contest to the will of Robert Whitfield, she said, based on allegations of undue influence, questionable notarization practices, and evidence of diminished capacity at the time of signing. Harold stood first, laying out the timeline methodically, Franklin Cole's original estate plan showing equal division, the medical records confirming significant impairment during the signing period, Gregory Pruitt's deposition admitting the undisclosed personal relationship with Marcus and the pressure to expedite the process, the $42,000 undisclosed transfer from the father's account into Marcus's failing business. The judge's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as each piece was entered, her earlier neutrality giving way to something more focused, more concerned. Marcus's attorney rose to object, his objections growing thinner and less convincing with each new document introduced into the record. This was never about honoring Dad's wishes, I said, when given my chance to speak, my voice steady despite everything churning beneath it. It was about your failing business. You planned this while he was still alive, still trusting you, I continued, looking directly at Marcus now. I did what I had to do to survive this, was the closest thing to an admission he'd offered in our final conversation, and I let those words hang in the courtroom air, unanswered by anything he could offer now. Marcus sat rigid beside his attorney, his jaw tight, his earlier composure entirely gone. Your Honor, Harold said, we have one final piece of evidence to present. Mr. Franklin Cole, the decedent's longtime attorney, has maintained a sealed envelope per specific instructions from Mr. Whitfield, to be opened only in the event of a formal contest to his estate. The courtroom went very quiet, every head turning toward Franklin as he rose slowly from his seat near the back. Your Honor, Franklin said, his voice carrying clearly despite his age, Robert Whitfield came to my office 4 years ago, shortly after his diagnosis. He told me he was concerned about pressure his son might face regarding the business, and about the possibility that pressure might someday extend toward the estate itself. He asked me to prepare this envelope, to be opened only if exactly this situation arose. He approached the bench, the sealed envelope trembling slightly in his weathered hands, and set it carefully in front of Judge Marsh. Your Honor, Franklin said, I believe you'll find this clarifies Robert Whitfield's true, considered intentions beyond any doubt. Judge Marsh accepted the envelope, examining the seal carefully before breaking it open, the courtroom holding its collective breath as she began to read. Judge Marsh read the letter slowly, her expression unreadable, the courtroom silent except for the faint rustle of paper as she turned to a second page. This letter is handwritten, dated 4 years prior to Mr. Whitfield's passing, she said finally, looking up. I'll read the relevant portion into the record. She cleared her throat and began. If this envelope has been opened, it means someone has tried to change what I've always intended for my children. I love both my son and my daughter equally, and I want my estate divided evenly between them, exactly as Franklin Cole's original documents specify. I've grown concerned about pressures on my son's business, and I worry that concern might someday translate into pressure on him to seek more than his fair share. If that has happened, I want the court to know clearly, my true wishes have never changed. Ellen and Marcus equally, as it should always have been. The courtroom stayed silent for a long moment after she finished reading, the weight of my father's own voice, preserved and waiting for exactly this moment, settling heavily over everyone present. I felt my throat tighten, tears finally slipping free after weeks of carefully controlled composure. He'd known. Somehow, years in advance, he'd anticipated exactly what might happen, and he'd made sure the truth would outlast whatever attempts someone made to rewrite it. Marcus sat frozen beside his attorney, his face drained of all color, staring at the envelope now resting on the judge's bench like it might somehow disappear if he looked at it long enough. "Marcus," Judge Marsh said, her voice carrying clear authority now, combined with the medical evidence, the undisclosed conflict of interest with the notary, the documented financial pressure on your business, and now your father's own preserved statement of intent, I find sufficient grounds to invalidate the will signed 3 weeks before his death. The estate will be distributed according to the original plan drafted by Franklin Cole, divided equally between both parties. That was the one reaction from the courtroom I let fully land, a collective exhale rippling through the gathered observers, Susan's hand pressed briefly against her mouth, Harold's quiet nod beside me. Marcus's composure finally broke completely, his shoulders sinking, his earlier defensive anger dissolving into something that looked, for the first time since this began, like genuine grief. "Ellen, please," he said, turning to me, his voice cracking. "This isn't what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I said quietly. "He just made sure the truth would outlast you." He didn't respond to that. He simply sat there, staring at the letter's now visible pages, the particular devastation of watching a carefully built justification collapse under the weight of his own father's foresight. Outside the courthouse, Susan found me first, pulling me into a hug fierce enough to hold both of us steady. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have trusted you from the beginning." "You're here now," I said. "That's what matters." Franklin Cole approached slowly, the leather portfolio now empty in his hands. "Your father was a careful man, right until the end. He wanted to protect you both, in his own way, even from each other if it came to that." "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with everything the morning had finally settled. "For keeping his real wishes safe all these years." 3 weeks later, the estate formally redistributed according to the original terms, the hardware store's shares divided fairly, the family home's proceeds split evenly between us. Marcus's business ultimately closed regardless, the debts too significant to overcome even with his eventual half of the inheritance, though that particular consequence felt separate now from anything I'd sought. Marcus and I haven't spoken since the hearing. I don't know if we ever will fully reconcile. Some betrayals cut too deep to simply forgive because the truth finally came out. I visited my father's grave the following month, the fountain pen resting in my palm, the same one he'd once promised would someday be mine, along with everything else, divided fairly between his children. "You knew," I told him quietly, my hand resting against the cool granite. "Somehow, you already knew exactly what might happen." The wind moved gently through the cemetery, and for the first time in months, I felt something loosen fully in my chest, not triumph, exactly, just the quiet, steady relief of a truth finally standing exactly where he'd always intended it to stand. If someone in your family ever tried to rewrite the truth before you had the chance to speak for yourself, tell me how you found your way back to what was real. Share your experience below. And for more stories like this, subscribe to Family Betrayal Verdict.